Well, good morning. Hate to interrupt everybody, but it is a little bit past time to get started this morning for class. We're up to Daniel chapter 7 this week, and I've been told this is the right one, so let's see. Daniel chapter 7. All right, we're good. So we actually have the right notes this time. Last week, if you were here, I didn't have my Daniel 6 notes up there, but Daniel chapter 7, I put on this, let the complexity begin, because it's starting to get a little bit different in some of the visions, and as we get a little bit more of the prophecies toward the second half of the book of Daniel, gets a little bit more, we'll say a little less straightforward, we'll say it that way. There is still a lot of, I think, pretty good clarity to it. But this is where we can start to get into some issues if we don't take the time to kind of look at what's really going on in some of these passages. A couple of things that are different in this one, we kind of jump back in time. If you remember the timeline of the last few chapters, chapter 5, Belshazzar was king. Saw the writing on the wall, Belshazzar no longer king by the end of the chapter. And then we have Darius the Mede, who's there for chapter 6 with the lion's den story. That is a little bit later in time. Now we're going to go back in time a little bit in chapter 7. So these aren't all, like the way this particular book is written isn't fully chronological. And so on this one, but it's clear of what's happening. We're going to go back to the first year of Belshazzar's reign. And instead of having visions being shown to King Nebuchadnezzar, like we saw in the early part of the book, now we're going to see an actual, and that was more geared toward what would happen to his kingdom and the kingdoms that would follow his kingdom. On that one, that was more of what Nebuchadnezzar's visions were. Now we're going to see Daniel having a vision in this one and how it really pertains to God's holy people. So where the other one was more from a secular view of how does this impact different kingdoms, to now how does this impact God's people as these kingdoms go from one to another. All right, so in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from others, came up out of the sea." And so this is where we get this vision of, he's looking toward this great sea that's getting churned up, and four different beasts are going to come out, and he's going to describe each one. He says the first was like a lion. It had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off and lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. What do you remember about Nebuchadnezzar's little 7 years of not so great luck? What happened to him? Walking around like an animal, had wings, feathers like an eagle, and so then he's picked up, put up onto 2 feet, given the mind of a human. I think you see the symbolism there and how this is a reference to the kingdom of Babylon. Again, and there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides. So you can kind of see kind of like a hunched over. It's two different groups. One of them's a little bit stronger than the other. The Medes and the Persians. Of the two, the Persians were the stronger than the Medes. And so you kind of see this description of a kingdom that's made up of two things. One's bigger than the other. And you see this hunched over bear like that, where it was raised up on one of its sides. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth and was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." And the Medes and the Persians were pretty good destroyers of people. They went out in conquering and took over many lands, and fits the description of what we see on this one as well. And then after that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given the authority to rule. Interesting thing, if you had 4 wings, you could sweep across the land very, very quickly. And that is what was known with the Greek empires, how quickly they were able to sweep over and take over lands. Interestingly, when Alexander the Great, who I think is probably the biggest known face of the Greek Empire, and his conquest, which conquered so much and really expanded that kingdom to its greatest point, when he dies, his kingdom was given to 4 of his generals. And so it broke into 4. And so the beast had 4 heads and were given the authority to rule. And again, you can see the Greeks being explained to on that one. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. The Romans come on scene here. It's had a large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Whoops, slow on there. Go back one. All right. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. A lot of times, this gets into a kind of an overlap into the study of a book like Revelation. Interestingly, why is that Revelation was written so that it could be spread amongst a very powerful empire that was going to be talked about. So I'm going to kind of step out of Daniel for a second, talk a little bit about Revelation. It'll make sense of why. Daniel was written so that people could understand in these visions that there were other kingdoms coming. He couldn't say, the Roman Empire is coming because, you can't talk about it in that kind of way without potentially altering the way things will shake themselves out. Because if you want to not let one of God's prophecies come true, you call it by name, and then somebody can say, well, fine, we'll call it the Rome Empire. Oh, that's not Roman. Whatever you can come up with, or the Italian Empire or something. You can come up with a way to kind of alter it. And God knows that, doesn't use the specifics. He uses symbolism when he talks about it. But then in hindsight, it's extremely clear who he's talking about. All right, so that symbolism, that understanding was very clear. Rome was filled with different Caesars, different emperors, these different horns that were on there. And during this period of time in which the early church endured so much persecution, emperor after emperor after emperor are taught. There is that last one, which in the book of Revelation would be the 8th horn. On this one, it would be the 11th one, because there's 10 prior to that. Those last 3 were so weak that the last one basically overtakes them. So in Revelation, they're not even hardly a consideration. And so they don't even really show up on the scene. And there's really 7 powerful ones, and then an 8th even more powerful one. On this one, it's 10, and then the 11th one comes in and gets rid of 3 of them, so you're back down to 8. So the numbers match. Why does this matter? Well, because in the book of Revelation, it was everything about it was all these things are about to happen. These things are shortly to come to pass. And the whole book of Revelation was written as a comfort to Christians being persecuted during the time of the Roman Empire, to say the beast doesn't win. Remember that beast? Daniel had a vision about it. Remember that beast? The beast dies. God's people live. That was the whole point of Revelation. They can't send a message around, and if they get it caught by the Romans, that they're like, oh, what, the Romans died? This is what you guys are going to tell everyone about? They'd all be annihilated for it. So instead, they write it in this code writing that made sense to them because they all knew the book of Daniel. So Daniel's reason he doesn't get specifics was also so that there could be a known code that was going to be needed during the time of that very powerful one. The Romans look at it like a beast is thrown into the abyss. Just go ahead, go do your thing. They don't know that it's actually talking about them. But if you know the book of Daniel, you're very clear that the beast is the powerful beast that everyone feared that was trampling God's people for a while. That's going to be the Roman Empire. So when you look at it, this is kind of a key to understanding the later book, because you have to understand the recipients of that in that day, risking their lives to spread it from town to town to encourage the Christians who are being persecuted. The book of Revelation then was shared as a way to say, hang in there. God is going to redeem his people. The souls of the martyrs under the altar crying out, how long until our blood is avenged? God said, I will avenge your blood. And that's the whole purpose of the book of Revelation. Well, it goes back to Daniel, because of these symbols and this imagery that he gives to us of who these are. So you have the first one, which is a lion. That pertains to the Babylonian Empire. It's really no different than the same vision that the head of gold, the chest of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron that you see with Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a statue. But now it's going to be 4 beasts that come in: the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then the last one, which is not given an animal. It's just frightening and different from the others. It's terrifying of a beast. It doesn't even match a description. It's so different than the other ones. And so that one, again, refers to how different of an empire the Roman Empire becomes. So we go on, and it says, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because the boastful words of the horn was speaking. All right, now we get a timeline. While this mouthy little horn is boastfully bragging against God and his people and boastfully talking bad things about Christ followers, oftentimes thought of as Emperor Domitian, who used to do horrific things to the Christians. So many of those, Nero and Domitian and all these other ones, would burn Christians alive just for lighting in their gardens. I mean, it was horrible things that it would do. They would do terrible things to God's holy people. So while the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority. They're already gone. And again, that would make sense because by the time we're to that terrifying beast, there is no Babylonian Empire. There is no Medo-Persian Empire. There is no Greek Empire. They've already been stripped of their authority. They were allowed to live for a period of time, but eventually they all get taken over. And now you have this Roman Empire, this beast that's being described here. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Back in chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream, what happened at the end of that dream of the statue that took the statue down? Do you remember? The rock that was cut out smashes, starting from the Roman Empire, everything falls apart and turns to chaff on this one. And then we get to this point where, and I think I told you 4, I meant 14 on Daniel. Are you guys ready for that? We'll read Daniel 14. I think I went ahead and read it, but I want to go ahead and have, Josh is going to read for us Daniel chapter 7, verse 14, if Josh is ready. All right, Josh, thank you. So his kingdom will never go away. We saw that in Daniel chapter 2, that during that time of the partially iron, partially clay-footed kingdom that had strength but had some brittleness to it that could be destroyed, God carves out another kingdom. He carves out a kingdom that will be eternal and everlasting. Here again, we see that same reference, same timeline. Things haven't changed on the timing of this. This is still going to happen during the time, and did happen during the time of the Roman Empire. That Christ came during the Roman times. The establishment of his kingdom was there. He's placed into glory and sovereign power during that time, and he's reigning on a throne that will never be destroyed. All right. So we see the unshakable kingdom. The mountain that cannot be destroyed, this kingdom that grows into a mountain that covers the whole earth, all nations and all people. You can go to anywhere on earth and you're going to find people who follow God, who worship him through Jesus Christ. It spreads around the world, and we see that. We see Jesus beginning his reign in his kingdom. And again, that's an important thing too, because when we get into understanding that the same symbolism from Daniel is going to be used in the book of Revelation, we can't then say, okay, but he's not on his throne. That's going to come later. That wouldn't make any sense. Because if he says, during the time where that boastful little horn won't shut his mouth and he's constantly saying these horrible things and doing these horrible things, during that time, I will come and establish my kingdom. Jesus reigns as king. We can't then turn around and say he's not reigning as king. And so to understand that unlocks an understanding of things in the book of Revelation that puts us into a better timeline of understanding about what it actually is about. So much of the book of Revelation isn't future events. It was events that were happening then. These were talking about things that were about to happen during this time period. Jesus reigns. When we get to this, we get to this timing then. As that boastful 10th horn is speaking against God, then we can place that to then say, okay, if that's what was happening at the time when Jesus takes his reign in his kingdom, then we have a better understanding of what Jesus' kingdom really looks like. He is on his throne right now. He is reigning in it. For us to say he's going to come back to earth and set up a kingdom here, why would he do that? He's got a better kingdom. He's in an unshakable, forever kingdom. Why would he come back here and do that? And why would that be hidden in one chapter of the book of Revelation if that's such a critical understanding of that? You know, when you look at it from that, and why would nobody have thought it until the year 1850 or 46 or whatever it was, when it was developed by a young girl in Scotland and one preacher in Scotland and Northern Ireland? They came up with that whole concept of that there was going to be another kingdom set up. No one ever thought that until about 150, 200 years ago. It was never, because nobody, it made no sense. That was an after the fact thing, and now most people who believe in God in some capacity think that's the way it's going to happen. It's mind-boggling how Satan has twisted that understanding and thrown it down there so that we don't accept the fact that Jesus came. Well, by the way, while I'm totally off on tangents left and right, what did John the Baptist say? What was his message? It's at hand. The kingdom of God is at hand. Not the kingdom of God is going to be teased by this guy who's going to come and talk about it, then he's going to wait thousands of years and set it up later. But don't worry, because it's all going to happen during modern America, because that's got to be what the book of Revelation's about. You know, when you look at it, it's so egocentric of us to even do that, to try to think that I remember standing in Washington, D.C., out in front of on the National Mall, right in front of the Lincoln Memorial, with a guy wearing a sign trying to convince everyone that Bill Clinton was the 10th horn. And I thought, and he was just like one of the ones before that because he was so much like JFK or something like that. And I was like, no. I was even a teenager at the time and thought, this isn't right. What is going on? Why? It's so clear. Jesus is on his throne now. He reigns now, not later. I mean, he will continue later, but he doesn't start later. He is on his throne now. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. And so he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. That's the encouragement. That same encouragement then is given again using this exact same symbolism to those who thought we lost to the Romans. That's really what the whole problem was in the book of Revelation. They're watching people being martyred around them, and they're like, we're losing. The church is going to be completely wiped out by these emperors. We've lost. And the whole point of that was, oh no, they haven't lost. You're down for a minute. Don't worry. Your time's coming. Your times and half a time is coming, actually. It really is about to come. On that one, if you know the reference, you know where I'm going with that. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the 4th beast, which was different than all the others, and most terrifying with its iron teeth and its bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others and had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. All right, so his answer is, as I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, which is why that same reference is going to be used when it happens. In the time of the Romans, when the church was being so horribly persecuted that they really truly felt that the end of the church was near, that they were going to be completely wiped out, God sends through a revelation given to John, a message that has snuck around to the Christians all over there saying, hang in there, I will avenge your blood. But during that time, while the war was being waged against them, verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. All of that was happening during that window of time. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and devour the whole earth. The Roman Empire, you can understand the whole earth to people of that time period, went way beyond what the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks. You can go up into England and find Hadrian's Wall and the northern extent of the Roman Empire out on an island in the North Atlantic. I mean, this took up the world. And so on this one, he says that it'll be different, devouring the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings that come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. So it's not going to be a huge gap in time that some other king is going to show up years and years later from a different kingdom and be similar to those. No, he is going to show up at the end of those and subdue 3 of them and take over. He'll speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and laws. He's trying to rewrite history, is what it says here. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. All right, so what is time, times, and half a time? Well, glad you asked. That's 3.5, right? 3.5 years. It's also referenced as 1,260 days in the book of Revelation, 42 months as well. This is going to be used over and over again. Daniel is later going to give us a prophecy of 70 weeks, and half of the 69th week, which would be 3.5, if you think of a week as 7 days, you get this 3.5 time period, which they aren't days, by the way, they're years. We'll get to that one. It's another chapter. Don't want to get too ahead of myself. But he's going to use that reference over and over and over again. We see this, though, in they come back to utilize the same time. Remember how there will be 3.5 years, a time, and half a times, and then God delivers all of you? That's the message of Revelation. You're in that. You're in the time, times, and half a time. It's going to be bad, but you'll get out of it. And so on this. So he keeps coming back to this understanding in the book of Revelation of what Daniel was talking about here, and that vision during the time of the Roman Empire. So in Revelation 12:6, it says, the woman fled into the wilderness at a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days, a time, times, and half a time. That woman referencing, again, the church that he holds in and he separates away. Revelation 12:14, the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly to a place prepared for her in the wilderness where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time. There's a reason why these were used, because it would make no sense to the persecutors. They could spread the message of hope to those around in code so that by the time they understood, oh, that's where we are right now. We're in that last little time period before God's unshakable kingdom reigns eternal. We just have to hang in there as these Romans try their best, kicking and screaming before they all go down. Interestingly, too, right after this time period, the Roman Empire crushes into pieces and becomes the Holy Roman Empire. Oddly enough, in its weird way of doing it and its eventual change of how they kind of do it, they were actually being run in a way of God following. They become a worshiping empire entirely from this. So we're going to see again this 3.5 reference come in during that 70 weeks prophecy as well, where Jesus takes his throne during the time of the Roman Empire. All right, so the last part. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. This is where I'll be honest, I think it gets a little bit more complex on trying to understand the exact, what does that particular look like? You know, is it that God's kingdom is now greater than any of the earthly ones and they don't amount to anything? And that's the sense in which all of the authority has now been given to us through this kingdom of his. And there's still world kingdoms going on, but in a lot of ways they're irrelevant to what really matters, which is his kingdom? Or is he jumping now ahead into the future and saying there will be a time where your kingdom's the only one left, God, and your holy people will be given everything, and all the rest of them are completely, gone away? That becomes a little bit more of a challenge on exactly how to interpret that particular part of it. But he does say that all rulers will worship and obey him. And I think we still see that reference being made of what happened to that kingdom, which was so against him, with its kings constantly trying to, you can imagine if the Caesars only knew that their kingdom would turn into a Christian kingdom for a while, the Holy Roman Empire, which, and again, if you look at history, started off all right, went way off the rails with time, but it started off all right. And so that idea of trying to establish a kingdom that was going to be devoted to God, that's the same kingdom that was fighting against God, trying to stamp out his kingdom, and he annihilates them and reestablishes them as one where his people are in control. It's interesting to watch how that kind of plays itself out, but I think you can kind of see where, while there may be a couple of parts to this that get a little bit hard to interpret perfectly, we see the big picture pretty clearly shaking out here. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts. My face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. What does he do, though, a little while later? This is where it's interesting. Put this into the timeline of his life for a second. When did all this happen? When did this dream occur? During what? Belshazzar's first year. What happens a few years later when Belshazzar is throwing his feast? I don't think it bothered Daniel at all when he goes in there. Notice it, remember his confidence when he goes in there? You can keep your gold and your purple and your positions of authority. I will tell you what many tekel parsin or upharsin, or depending on which version you read it from. Well, that numbered, or weighed, divided. I will tell you exactly what that's about. You're going down. Just like all the rest of them will, and God's people will be the ones who finally win. It may not be tomorrow. It may not be the next day, but they're going to win. And now we get to see and reap the benefits of what all those people did living through those times of great peril, so that God's kingdom is now unshakable. Oh, they can try to do things to us individually. They can outcast us in certain countries. They can kill us, but his kingdom, here we are. Where are the Romans? Gone. I mean, you can go to Rome and you can see it crumbling. You can walk around the ruins there and see maybe the Colosseum's about the best one that's still standing. The Forum is just an old rocky path with a couple columns left out of all of it. You can go to all these places which were so foreboding. They're so far down deep now, too, that the ground has piled up with dust and dirt, and now they're lower than the rest of the city. And the rest of Rome is, well, it's not what it once was. And yet, God's kingdom is exactly what it has always been and what it will always be. Anybody have any final thoughts? Yeah, yay. It's a good thing we win. That's the good message of that. So, all right, we will continue on in Daniel next week. So if you're done for the day, have a great rest of your day. If you're here for second service, stick around.